thinking in my own preparation that, leading this deal or helping to lead it, I just think of myself so much as a learner and a student of meaningful conversation. I mean, you never arrive at this. And so I hope that all of you will just kind of take on that I'm here to, see what the Lord has for me today, because I care about connecting with other people. And so I just invite you all in and look forward to our time together.
Great, Pam. I think as we enter into this, I am one of the things about kingdom sorts of things is there's an urgency to them. And I think for what we talk about today, and for your even showing up, there is an urgency of learning how to cultivate spiritual conversation with other people and etc. But as with all sort of kingdom things, there's also a patience about it. It's not something you hurry into or out of or try to force someone through. And so as we talk, we're going to be teetering here with urgency and patience as sort of these themes. Nouwen's quote, which was part of the promotional way of inviting you to this, as well as on your handout, has kind of thrown me back to the 90s when I was working as a resident director at Biola University. And right out of seminary, graduate school, in which I was largely trained to stand behind a lectern or stand behind a podium and to do that sort of work, great work that needs to be done. But one of the graces in my life is the Lord put me right into a residence hall at Biola University. And quickly, over first 6 months, that would turn out to be 4 years and then longer, I began to realize that the sort of invitation that the Lord was inviting me into was maybe some means or ways about ministering with people that was less of a monologue and more of a dialogue. And it was the metaphors, instead of lecterns and pulpits, were coffee tables and foosball tables and kitchen countertops. And one of the things that would emerge in my office is you would have a junior or senior once or twice a month kind of walk in sheepishly into my office. And this is a sort of place in which they've heard Beth Moore on Monday, Chuck Swindoll on Wednesday, and maybe, Billy Graham's coming in 3 weeks. And so they are full of wonderful things being told to them. But by their junior or senior year in college, a number of things start to happen. Life hits them at a place like Biola University, and sometimes that's a relational breakup, and they end up in my office, or some sort of deep need in my office. But one of the things that would often happen is someone would begin to sort of try to share out loud that everything that they're hearing in their Bible classes and in their chapel sounds an awful lot like wah, 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 wah after a while. And they feel all alone with that reality. Why am I the only one that feels that way? And I loved that seat for a number of reasons, but the one that keeps on coming to my mind is they don't know that in the last 2 months, 4 or 5 other people on their hallway have confessed the same thing. And so when I began to work with Vantage Point 3 with adults, I do think there is still that feeling often when we talk about spiritual conversation that an awful lot of the longing for it is unspoken. And occasionally the equivalent of a 45 or 65 or 28-year-olds wah, 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 wah sets in, and they yearn for space. And there's not a lot of foosball tables or even coffee tables in some of our ministry work. And so I think, Pam, that sort of metaphor keeps on coming to mind as we walk into this conversation. And I know this week you've been sort of poking around and getting grabbed. I got a story in my head. You got some statistics of some things that have been
well, and some of you, we're hearing this in the media as well, but and Harvard University did, and it's been over a year ago. So my gut is that these statistics would be even more amplified, but it was a study on loneliness in America as it relates to the pandemic. And prior to the pandemic, their data supports that 40% of adults report that relationships were not meaningful, that 40% of their relationships were not meaningful, and that 1 in 5 or 20% of adults reported, this is pre-pandemic, that they were regularly felt lonely. So now take it into the heart of the pandemic, which this research was released in February of 21. It's the complete survey on loneliness in America to date. But they reported now that 36% of adults say that they feel lonely often, frequently, which leads to a whole host, of medical and physical and spiritual and emotional troubles. But here's kind of an alarming subcategory of that, and something that I hope touches each of us, is that within that data, the age group of young adults, which they identified as 18 to 25-year-olds, 61% frequently or all the time feel lonely. And 51% of mothers of young children feel that. And the young adults would say that when they think about their day or even the last while, that part of what contributed to that is that no one has taken time to genuinely ask me how I'm doing and have a meaningful conversation. And so I just feel like this ever-present need, Rob, that you identified 2 decades ago is just continuing to heighten. And I think of, in John 10, it says that the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but I have come to give you life and give it to the full. And I just think it's kind of creepy how we've been kind of torn apart in the belief that we don't need, and how to come toward the intention of a meaningful conversation. So I think this is important work. I want to introduce our friend who's at the table here with us and helping us to lead with us today. Wendy Delcourt is in Kelowna, BC. She has been a longtime friend of Vantage Point 3, and I'll probably get it wrong, but she's led 10 plus journey groups around tables, I think often in her home, and developed wonderful friendships. She's a board member now with Vantage Point 3, and she's going to help lead us and to just, jump into the deep end of the pool. Will you set up for us, Wendy, this first conversation we want to have together?
Oh, I'd love to. Thanks, Pam. We are going to engage in one of my favorite activities that I use among so many of my circles. It's actually called an art walk. So in a few minutes, we are going to engage you on a virtual art walk. And it's basically an opportunity to spark some connection within you and to find some inspiration to some of your story, to connect us to something meaningful in your life. Sometimes it takes a prompt, an inspiration of some sort to do that. And the invitation to you is to do a little wonder, to become a better and deeper and original noticer of one of these images and choose one that sings to you. Don't overthink, don't try too hard, but something that sings to you and connects to you somehow. And I want you to recall the image or the number of the image or take a photo of the image. And then we're just going to gather and hear what prompted in you from the image.
So we have 3 questions we're going to kind of dive into, as you can tell from the handout. The first is why it's so hard to experience good spiritual conversation. Let me make a comment too. And today, I think by way of application, good spiritual conversation, there's a range to that when we're talking about this. I mean, we're talking about we're imagining when we talk about really good spiritual conversation, kids soccer sideline conversations, kitchen table in your neighborhood, asking the next question of people. We're also imagining maybe something a little more formal, that's a spiritual friendship or a mentoring or a small group of people that engage with one another at some level with more formality than your sort of neighborhood or dinner table. How do we take a dinner table conversation deeper? And then we're also imagining something like the journey process, in which it's 6 to 7 months of extended conversation about some of these deepest questions of your lives. So we asked you via survey, and I think Pam put on her researcher hat and paid attention to the responses. So Pam, what did you find? Why is it so hard to experience good spiritual conversation?
Well, great responses. First of all, thank you to those who responded. And here's some of my summary of that, is that overall, we're conditioned to talk about easier things. Mm-hmm. And we then aren't comfortable with conversations where we aren't sure kind of where it's going. Or I noticed we aren't sure if we know enough. That was a really big noticing to me, is that we're afraid of knowing if we're going to know enough, which says something to us, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. And that spiritual things can often feel too intimate, like we're getting into a territory that's kind of, you don't go there. Most people, they said, just don't want deep conversation. So there's a paradigm that's what's going on. And there's also a sense of a fear of that in the whichever side of the conversation on, there's judgment going on. And then it was brought up that if we have been hurt in a conversation where we were vulnerable, we haven't forgotten that. And so we're not going to go into a more vulnerable place or what may feel vulnerable until we feel safe. And then there's just off the top, just the sense that we don't have these deeper conversations because we're afraid. Mm-hmm. And the last one is just a sense that I pulled out from those that were shared, is that it's kind of wild, but I'm just not good enough. I'm just not good enough to be a part of. I don't have anything to offer.
I know what caught my attention is we are not sure we know enough. Some version of that's what's required if we're going to take a conversation deeper is, and I looked at a couple of them too, Pam, and there's, needing to know the right scripture verse, or, those sorts of little barriers, I think that caught my attention as we did it. And then I was struck, as you just shared, that either side of the conversation, there's some judgment. Like if I want to take it deeper, I'm going to be perceived as being judgmental with someone, or vice versa, not wanting to be judged by this sort of conversation. I know, Wendy, Pam, when we talked about some of these, one of the big ideas that it's already been on the table is we think that affects this experiencing good or cultivating good or being a catalyst or for good spiritual conversation is so many people think they are all alone with what they are experiencing in life. And I was struck in two cases. Both of you shared a story of just some of the ways that aloneness grabbed your attention. Wendy, you talked about a Pilates class. Do you remember that story?
I don't know if any of you continued with your exercise regime during COVID, or if you were allowed, but I was allowed to go to my Pilates class with a mask on. And it was so weird being in a room full of amazing women and having a mask on and exercising a foot away, not being able to say anything. And you could just see in them a longing to connect. Like we were trying to talk through our masks, trying to stay and mingle after, which we weren't allowed to do. So I just decided, I just felt prompted that I'm going to consider building the community that I long for. I'm just going to take this little leap. So I invited 10 of the women over to my home because you were allowed 10 people in BC at the time, and just to gather together. And I pulled out one of my little party tricks. I was like show and tell in kindergarten too, is one of my faves. But I had objects, random objects in paper bags. And I thought, some of these women don't even know each other. So I had them choose a paper bag, and then they just had to open it and pull out an object and share a story from it. And honestly, I've been doing this for 25 years, and I've never once had anything repeated or the same sort of connection made. But what surprised me out of this group was the instant depth to the conversation. Like I had one woman just pull out a map, and she was the one that got caught with her daughter in the landslides at the Coquihalla when the landslide broke the bridges away, and they weren't even sure if they were going to be rescued. And she went right to that story instantly. And another one talked about her first marriage, and another one talked about having to leave Africa and immigrate over to Canada. Like it was just instant, heartfelt, and you could just see them resonating with this and enjoying this. And the feedback from just literally having people over with a few story bags was, can we do this every weekend? Oh my God, I love this. And then they were so excited, they even jumped in the lake in March. It was freezing. So we chili dipped, and we did breath work. We did Pilates. We made lunch, and we just kept going for 8 hours. And then I had to tell them to leave. It was one of those, but it was fantastic. And I just realized I had to consider building the community I long for and just give it a go, just give it a try. And God just blessed that time so powerfully.
Oh, that's cool, Wendy.
Yeah,
it's not hard to imagine you pulling that puppy off a little bit. So when we shared that story, when you shared that story first with us, Pam, then you told a story.
Oh,
yeah.
I was Pastor Pam.
Mm-hmm.
And go ahead.
Well, so I was invited some time ago, my husband and I, to officiate a wedding that the couple ended up deciding to get married in Cancun. And that happened this past March 4th. And so we were to be there 4 days with, it was my son's, a good friend of my son's. And we didn't really know what we'd gotten ourselves into. And more or less, we didn't know that many people. There was 70 people there. But as over the days, they learned that I was officiating the wedding and was the pastor on site, I guess you'd say. And this group of young people in their 30s, primarily in their late 20s and 30s, in a large group, you would say, this is not a spiritual group. That is what you would conclude. However, they would start coming to, in the pool, on the beach, at a meal, all of a sudden, one-on-one, they would just start visiting with me about deeply meaningful things, the kinds of churches they had grown up in, the kind of work of life, a way they're trying to find their life with God, and just like a confessional of what they were up to and what they were seeking and what they were hungry for. And I just found myself just with a picture of these young people that all collectively did not know that they were all looking for, a deep spiritual connection. They didn't know it. It's like your dorm situation. Right. They didn't know it about each other.
Right.
Wow.
And for most of them, it's going to require some sort of, I'll use the word leadership, someone to convene, to be a presence. And, for those of us that have had the privilege of being, so to speak, priests for other people, it happened because someone did that for us, right? And at key moments, and we've learned it, along the way. So at some level, this is a little bit of a, if you want to ponder this a little bit, even just the way Jesus is about that, two conversations to sort of sink into. If something about today really grabs your attention, I would pay attention to John 3 and John 4.
Mhm.
Nicodemus, he's a little bit like the Cancun thing, kind of sneaking off. I can imagine he didn't have his beer or whatever, that needing to talk versus the woman at the well, and just the complexity and deep interestedness of Jesus in her as well. And so thanks for responding to it. The second question is, let's talk about ingredients, right? And what qualities or ingredients help set the table for better spiritual conversations? And remember, the table has some scope to it, some range, different types. Beaches like Cancun, Pilates groups in a living room, journey groups gathered together, one-on-one. Pam, you want to walk us through a little bit of helping us kind of participate?
Yes, I do. I want to share a set of questions with you, and I want you to think about your own context. Let me just start at the top here, is that you chose to be a part of this online conversation today for some reason. So what was that? Like, you can make a note, write something down. What was there an experience? Was there a yearning, a longing? Is there a conversation that you have had that you feel fell short or knocked it out of the park and got you thinking about this? Who are the faces that you're seeing as you're also kind of listening to us? Who are those people? What table is it that you're hoping to set? Who's around that table that you're hoping to be more intentional with? And what's getting in the way of that conversation being what you might hope it could be? What is that barrier or barriers? And I just invite us, while we're thinking about this, those of you who like to chat, to add comments in the chat box, like, when you think about the ingredients that are required for a deeply meaningful conversation or getting it started, what are those ingredients? Like, for you, what are they? What are the ingredients to a better conversation? Whether you're the convener or you're the, a part of it. What is it? The intentionality, curiosity, trust, open-mindedness and authenticity, presence, hospitality, intentionality and vulnerability, willingness to be vulnerable on both sides. It's safe. Ooh, I like leaning in and listening, which means that somebody's asking questions, right?
Hmm.
So there's a curiosity, a relaxed, I like unhurried atmosphere. You love them rather than that they love them rather than I know more than you. So that kind of that powerish stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And a non-anxious presence. These are all good. See, we can create data. We could be our own little Harvard. Rob, what are you noticing? Oh, I like that unagended.
Yeah, I think I'm just soaking it in. I think the one I almost just sat down to write is there's a kindness too that's just assumed, because when it's not there, it shuts down stuff. So, that proverbial, but I in this list, Pam, I think adults won't share. I think you're the one that often says this, unless they have a safe place, unless they feel respected. I mean, that's just 101. I think Malcolm Knowles did a good bit of research on that one. And so some of these are all ways in which we create such a safe space for other people. So that grabs me, in the middle of it, as well as the kindness, sort of. Go ahead.
Well, I would add too that an assumption that we can, on adults, an assumption that we can absolutely take home to the bank is that if an adult shows up, if you have extended an invitation to XYZ, an adult shows up, or I say votes with their feet, you can absolutely assume, like the ones that came to Wendy's Pilates retreat, they are hungry. They want to participate. They want to be known to some level. And adults have things to say. They really do. Every single adult has things to say. Everyone.
Wendy, anything grab your attention as this list sort of builds here?
Yeah, the two words I love is the growing, that we come together to grow together in these connections. And that, what does love look like? Like a person needs to feel love them rather than to know more than them. And I think that's an invitation with every person we encounter to ask, what does love look like with this person? So those two words, the growth and the love part, which takes courage, to show up in that mindset.
Last week, as I was writing, and I asked you guys a couple questions. Last week, as I was sort of thinking a little more deeply about this topic, the three things came to mind kind of as and I put them here on there. So I'm not going to talk a lot about them, but there's a blog on the Mentoring Way website. But it says the quality of conversation we offer others is inextricably tied to the quality of attention we provide others. And that may seem like so basic, but I would ponder that for a while, like becoming more attentive. We're not just going to give you a list of questions, although a couple good questions help, but it grows out of a certain sort of character and attentiveness toward other people. And if people ask me, well, how do you learn how to be more attentive? I mean, that's a 16-week class, right? Or that's a lifetime of learning, of which I'm much more familiar with being a distracted person than I am an attentive person. But these three bullets are often sort of growing edges for people. And I think learning to begin where people are, particularly for those of us in leadership circles, we often lean more to where people could be, where we need to take everybody. And we are too quick not to show a deep interest in where folks are now. And so whether it's a dinner table conversation or a leadership rally, learning to begin where people are is a great sort of discipline for us to sort of practice. Learn to patiently get below the surface. There's a lot there. I mean, Jesus does this particularly with question asking and storytelling, is how he gets below the surface consistently in people's lives. He involves them. Pam will often say the answers are in the room. Like, we don't got to go searching for the expert. Let's stay here and talk about it. And at some level, that's one of the key ways she's learned to involve people in their lives, in the way that Jesus does that with good questions and stories. And then learning to reflect theologically, that's a bit loaded. I think what's sort of meant by that in here is, a person I've read a fair amount about says that there's a theological reflection begins not with the question, what would Jesus do in this or that situation? But the better question is, what is Jesus doing in this or that situation? And so there's this strong assumption that God's already up to something good. And so there's an expectation that begins to cultivate that. I think for some of us, I don't know all of you, but I think for some of us, there's sort of a feeling that we have to carry this great weight of being the deep person in the room. That is probably head trash for those of us that carry that weight. It might actually be a good defense against the spirit in our own life, but that's a different conversation. What it is though is begin to realize that God's already ahead of us, and doing something in people's lives. We're there to discern and pay attention and those sorts of things. That kind of takes the weight off of us having to make something happen at this conversation or this, and rather one of the things that would help each of us is, as we're on the soccer sidelines, or you're in a journey group, or you're sitting across the table from someone that wants to talk about these things, is cultivating a bit of an expectancy in their lives that God's already doing something. And so those three things sort of come to mind as growing edges. If you want to read more about that, there's the blog that we've shared. But I'm curious how this kind of gets played out, Pam, and where are we at? Yeah, let's do this. So Pam, tell your, so Pam, the conversation starter in all sorts of places for your daughter's 35th birthday.
Yes. So an ingredient that I think I would now add to our list is collaboration. Along the lines of what Rob is saying, is that we don't have to be the know-it-all in our conversations with other people. So I was hosting a week ago a 35th wedding or 35th birthday party for my daughter. And there was going to be about 12 or 15 people around our table, mostly family, and a 2 or 3 people who know her really well. I had, in fact, text each of them and said, tonight at dinner, think about a story of a way, that you remember about Laura that would be fun to share with everybody. In the middle of the afternoon, I get a text from Laura, and she says to me, knowing her mother, I don't want any obituary style storytelling tonight at dinner. And I kind of gasped like you guys did. And I thought, oh, I've been called out. And I was discouraged. And so I just let it go for a little bit. And then I text her back and I said, well, I love intentional conversation. And she says, I love intentional conversation too. Let's come up with a better question. And so when she got to our house, I said, again, it could have been lost, but I chased her around my island and I said, what would be a good question that you would like? And she said, well, I don't like the spotlight on myself, which is true. And she said, how about if we just enlarge it? What are each of you celebrating today? If you could choose something that you are celebrating, what would it be? So when we sat down at dinner, Laura and I shared what we had happened to us. And then she said to the table, so I'd love to hear what you're each celebrating today. And around the table it went. We heard things that we didn't know, even though we know each other. There were things we didn't know. And in particular, a 19-year-old college student said bravely, the last 2 years have been really disappointing to me, but I am 2 months from finishing my freshman year. And I am starting to have hope, and I'm starting to pursue such and such, and I'm excited about it. And I just feel like it's worth celebrating. And then from that, each of us were able to speak into Erica's life about something we would have never tripped onto. It was just so good.
Good for Laura.
So I think about collaborating with whomever we're wanting to have that more meaningful. Like, what is it that they want to talk about? Sure. We don't have to be the answer people all the time. And takes the weight off.
Wendy, I want to put you on the spot too. So we were part of a Zoom meeting, maybe 2.5 months ago.
Yeah.
And to that meeting, as I invited everyone to consider to look at the Jumpstarting an Intentional Spiritual Conversation PDF. Everyone has, it's the back of the handout. Okay. And we designed that as a way to help people practice their companioning skills with one another, that back and forth. You'll look at that. We've also used it as a way to, someone just doesn't know where to start, but they have a hunger for it. And so it's kind of like the equivalent of those older school evangelism seminars where they, teach you a couple things and then you up on a bus and you're at the mall. And I'm like, I just wanted to hear some more. I didn't want, but this is sort of an activation sort of deal with going deeper with people. So I gave that to you, and then you did something with it I never imagined out of PDF. So tell them what you did with that 2-page PDF.
Well, another thing that I find to be a little bit unburdensome is that you don't have to create your own curriculum all the time. You can go to a trusted source. And my 16 years of Vantage Point 3 has built great trust in the tools and the resources from Vantage Point 3, like the Mentoring Way Guide and the Jumpstart PDF. It kind of looks like this, you guys. It's in your little attachment. But Rob was just kind of playing with this idea of helping leaders continual meaningful conversation in community, and offered 3 conversations in this PDF. And for me, I'm a hands-on experiential learner. I learn by doing. So I just kind of sat with this and prayed about it. And then I just felt prompted to connect with a journey group that I'd facilitated 6 years ago. It was 7 women, all different ages, with like a 20-year age range and very diverse stages of life. And I just put it out there. And I'm like, what are you doing on a Wednesday afternoon at 11:30? Do you want to hang out and have a few conversations? And I sent out this PDF, and 4 of them responded and said, I could probably do that. And as I unpacked a little bit about what the weeks would look like, all 7 of them all of a sudden became available and created space for this. And what I learned is, while we sat around the table, there was a lot of tears and a lot of like, man, this is what I've been missing. Like, I've been longing for this. I forgot that I know how to do this. I forgot how important it is to take time to just create space for these kind of conversations. And what was beautiful was it just organically unfolded with the prompts provided in the PDF. And the funny thing is after the 3rd week, they didn't want to stop. So we had to do a 4th week so we could have a celebratory meal together and kind of bring our own story or show and tell prompt to set them up to do this on their own. And even from that, we had one instigate a journey group, Rob, because they wanted to continue with these types of conversations. And the other beautiful, unexpected thing is, one of the sisters in our group has just been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer and is now in palliative care. So we rallied, not even realizing, around a circumstance like this in such a powerful way. And it was a real blessing for all of us. And now we're all marching this path with her as she goes through this journey. So God, again, used that in a much more powerful way than anticipated.
Thanks for sharing that, Wendy.
Yeah.
I suppose let's turn to the last question. I think I want to put some burden on your own minds. There's obviously a lot that we could talk about when it comes to ingredients, right? If you're like hungry for more of that sort of conversation, I would encourage you, if you don't have this little mentoring guide, to grab it. That is the way it's designed. It is chock full of ingredients and processes to think through how to deepen a conversation. And if you have this book, there's a bibliography in the back and you've read it, go pick one of the books in the back that we're referring to and use that as a prompt. But that's more the learner for each of you, which we tend to have a few learners that show up at something like this. But where might the Spirit be inviting you to set the table for the spiritual conversations we long for most? And one of the things I think the Spirit of God is always doing, in different ways and at different volumes, and sometimes we miss it, but the Spirit's always inviting us to a deeper relational life with himself, with Jesus, but also deeper relational life with others. They don't compete in that way. There's something, and that's a longer conversation, but I want you to think through the spheres of influence that you find yourself in. Family, neighborhood, church community, workplace. Where might he be inviting you to be a bit of a catalyst, right? And it need not be some grand thing, or maybe it is. Maybe it's a little more risky. I don't. But just to begin to ponder that and to consider it. And in many ways, this jump-starting little document, the last 2 pages of your handout, is designed, because if you don't want to do that, there's no sense working at it too hard. But if there's this desire and this longing to be that sort of presence, and maybe it's just to initiate with a friend or someone else that is already loves this sort of thing too, and you begin to get together and just have some deeper conversations. Maybe, for some of you, that's part of sort of what we do. For some of you, we're praying that you starting thinking about leading a journey group next fall. But as you think about your sphere of influence, what does it look like for you to take some risks and to convene conversation?
I was just thinking again, we're all in circles with other Christians. And then we also, our lives interface with people that we don't really know, but we have a chemistry with and we like. And it makes me think about those young people in Cancun. Like, you can kind of assume that these people you know on a fringe way do not have an interest in spiritual things. And I think that's the wrong assumption. And so how can you invite them into a meaningful conversation just as a friend? Mm-hmm. And maybe it's not the questions that we had on that PDF, but it's your questions, and it fits for this group. And you're introducing them to 3 conversations together to meet at my house 3 times over the next 4 weeks. And people can go, yeah, I'd like to do that. They can see a start, they can see a finish. Mm-hmm. And don't be they have to be the answer person. Collaborate, just collaborate. You're collaborating with the Spirit. That's what's going through my head.
Oh, yeah.
We make it too complicated.
Yeah, that's right.
And the world is trying to steal. The thief is trying to steal life in its fullness from us.
Mm-hmm. There's a phrase that's been running through my mind a little bit over the last 3 months. I think I heard Patrick Lencioni talk about it on a podcast, and it's a Chinese proverb. And the proverb is, "When's the best time to plant a tree?" And the proverb says 10 years ago. Right? When's the second best time to plant a tree? Today. And as we step back over the last 2 years of particular intensity, it's clear to see in some of your lives and in many people's lives, the folks that planted some trees 20 years, 30 years ago with this sort of stuff. And they ran toward people in this time of suffering. They moved toward them. They knew how to do that. And it's deeply gratifying to be a part of it. The gentleman for me was Randy Reese in 1996, back of a Jeep, leaned back and he goes, "Rob, what you been thinking about?" That was it. No one had ever asked me that question. And I was 26 years old. And, or at least I wasn't listening if anyone else had asked, but I was ready at that moment. And I think for each of us, the Lord's inviting us to be these conversational catalysts in the world, right? That might be a little bit what it looks like to be salt and light in communities that are dominated by people talking at them and very little dialogue. And so that's our prayer. At a deeper level, I think the longing here is you're longing for deeper spiritual conversations. I want you to to consider that just maybe it's more than just a longing. There might be a calling and a vocation in that. Sometimes the things we long for most are also an expression of the way the Spirit wants to work through us and in us. And so maybe it's time to plant a tree this spring. Let me pray for you. I have a prayer. It was at the end of the blog. Let me pray this for you as a group, and thank you for joining us. The prayer is this: Father, we confess how hard it is to cultivate real spiritual conversation in our everyday lives, but we long for it. May you convert our hunger for spiritual conversation into a vocation and a calling. May we become more attentive, detectives of divinity, wherever we find ourselves. And may we become catalysts for deepening conversation and companionship in our communities. Spirit, be generous to our life together. In Jesus' name.